But what about all the alternative sources of energy? Unconventional oils like tar sands and oil shale, nuclear power, clean coal, renewable sources like solar and wind. Surely, with all the alternatives, we'll be able to make up for the energy we lose from oil depletion, won't we? Well, we may not be so lucky.
We have an enormous amount of energy that we need to replace, that we're going to lose as oil production declines. And it's going to decline fairly steeply. I mean, some of the statistics from petroleum geologists who have been looking at this are suggesting, 3, 4, 5, even 6% rates of decline per year.
People have a real tough time imagining how bad it can actually get. And they think that primarily technology will save the day. And that makes sense because we've lived in the past 200 years in this period of growing technology as we've industrialized. But there is a distinct difference between energy and technology. Technology can be invented, but you still need energy to run that technology. And if you take energy out of the system, you actually will not be able to get that technology distributed into the marketplace quickly enough.
There are a lot of alternative energy sources out there waiting to be developed. Some of them already have been developed on a small scale: solar, wind, nuclear, tidal power. There are several different kinds of solar energy. The list goes on. I've identified between 25 and 30 different ones. So there are a lot of possibilities, and I think the average person thinks, well, there's so many candidates that inevitably, surely, as fossil fuels wind down, the market will, create incentives to develop these others, and we'll have a more or less seamless transition from a fossil fuel economy to an alternative energy economy, whatever that turns out to be. A lot of people say that there's still lots of oil left in the ground, that we're nowhere near peak oil because we have enormous amounts of tar sands in Canada, heavy oil in Venezuela, and so on. But we're not really talking about the same kind of stuff that we've been using for the past few decades. This is material that has to be mined from the ground. It can't just be pumped. It's not under pressure. We don't get, gushers of tar sands. We have to go in with giant shovels and dig the stuff out of the ground and then process it. It's very energy intensive, resource intensive. And here's the real kicker: it's slow. We get about 1.5 million barrels a day from the tar sands currently, and the U.S. uses close to 20 million barrels a day of oil. So will we be able to grow the supply from the tar sands to 5 million barrels a day, 10 million? Absolutely not. We've assumed that we have 250 years worth of coal, but my recent studies indicate that global coal production could peak around 2025. For the U.S., only a few years later. For China, much sooner. Already, there are many countries in the world where the lights are out several hours a day, and in some cases, like India, that's because of coal shortages.
There was a drive at the national level to subsidize ethanol. Well, as soon as we put in that ethanol subsidy, there was an incentive for farmers to send more of their crops, especially their corn crops, to the ethanol plants and less going to the feedlots, feeding cattle, for example. Well, that drove up the price of beef. So right away there, that's a 4 or 5 order system change. You have rise in the price of gasoline, you have a response in terms of federal subsidies that raises the cost of corn, it raises the cost of meat.
The fact is that we're using so much energy from oil and natural gas and coal that we can't make up the difference of what we're about to lose with those alternative energy sources.
Wind will make sense in some places, not others. So having distributed resources, as opposed to, say, a big new nuclear plant, or even some of these solar thermal plants that we've been hearing about, that's a centralized resource. That is a lot of investment capital, that is many, many miles of transmission line going across vast distances. It's simply a different way we need to be thinking about our energy sources.
So if we cannot make up the shortfall in energy from fossil fuels with alternative sources, what will that mean for the economy, for transportation, for housing, for food production? What impacts will peak oil have on the way we live our lives?
As a result of declining oil production in the U.S. economy over the past few decades has shifted from manufacturing to the financial industry. And as that happened, we relied more and more on debt and on sophisticated investment and leveraging instruments. And we, in effect, created a house of cards. And that house of cards was able to stay up as long as the economy continued to grow at a fairly rapid pace. But as oil production reached its maximum between 2005 and 2008, the energy basis for economic growth started to wither away. And as that happened, it pulled the rug out from under this financial house of cards. And as a result, the whole thing has essentially collapsed.
So the rate at which we're moving off of the fossil fuels has actually slowed down because of the credit crisis. And a number of people indicated that this was likely going to happen, that once oil spiked, like it did in the summer of 2008, the credit would dry up, and then the speed at which we could move off of fossil fuels would actually decline. And that's exactly what we're seeing.
Something like $150 billion worth of new oil production projects have been canceled over the last 18 months, 2 years, something like that. So as a result of that, new oil production that would have gone to offset some of the declines is not going to appear. So going forward, if we know we're not going to be able to continue growing the supply of oil, that has enormous implications for the global economy. It means, in effect, that we won't have economic growth in the future.
A lot of people don't know that our infrastructure is actually falling apart. The American Society of Civil Engineers has given the infrastructure for the United States a grade of D. And they say that $2.2 trillion is needed in just the next 5 years to stop it from deteriorating. So all the infrastructure that we have built from the beginning of the last century, the early 1900s, and the post-World War II building boom, they're coming to the end of their lifespan. We have the end of the lifespan for dams, for water pipes, for sewer systems, for roads, for bridges. And we're not doing the work that's needed to replace those. Robert Hirsch was the lead author of a team that looked at what the risk was to the United States economy of peak oil. And he looked at it and he assumed, or his team assumed, that there would be a crash program to get off of oil at some point. And he looked at what happened in 73 and 79, and he saw that the economy contracted at a certain rate. And then he looked at some other data points. And the result that he came to was that the economy is likely going to contract at roughly a 1-to-1 ratio as oil contracts. So if we lose 5 million barrels a day in a 3-year period, and that means a 15% loss of oil, well, our economy is likely going to shrink by 15%. If the country only started to get off of oil right at the peak of production, and we were dealing with the imploding economy and the lack of extra cash to do the investments necessary at the same time that oil was being removed from the system, which is exactly what's happening, then he predicted pretty much disaster.
If you can't assume that the price of oil is going to be relatively affordable 5 years or 10 years from now, it becomes very difficult to, say, plan a light rail system or plan a highway expansion. We need to have a basic understanding of where people are going to be driving to. Are they going to be able to afford fuel to get around to do what they need to do? These are assumptions that we could pretty well make even 5 years ago, because the supply of oil was generally increasing while the demand of oil was increasing. Now that that's no longer the case, we suddenly have very little basis for making these very important decisions.
Oil has come to fuel virtually all of our transportation, so global trade relies almost entirely on oil. So as oil becomes more expensive, that impacts the economy. Every time we have an oil price spike, we have a recession. And actually, that's one of the reasons that we're in a recession right now. We had the mother of all oil price spikes back in 2008, and that impacted the trucking industry, the automobile industry, airline industry.